So, carrying on with Act 2, Gwendolen says, in an exchange with Cecily, to speak with perfect candor, Cecily, I wish that you were fully 42 and more than usually playing for your age. Ernest has a strong, upright nature. He is the very soul of truth and honour. Disloyalty would be as impossible to him as deception. And there's a number of various forms of tension and irony that go on here. Gwendolen sort of paying her a backhanded compliment, revealing that she thinks she's attractive. But the fact that she says Ernest has a strong, upright nature, he's the soul of truth and honour, obviously has an immediate sense of irony because the name itself is ironically undercut by the fact that he is lying to her about who he is. Disloyalty would be as impossible to him as deception. Well, of course, deception is part of the nature of his character in this play, and so disloyalty as well is sort of inflected by this dishonesty. So the sort of emphatic quality of this ironic line actually sort of motivates and gives credence to her suspicions of him, and that sort of explains her jealousy on his part. They carry on discussing this over the page about Ernest and his brother. They've not been on good terms for a long time. Cecily, you've lifted a load from my mind. I was growing almost anxious. It would have been terrible if any cloud had come across a friendship like ours, wouldn't it not? Of course, you are quite sure that it is not Mr. Ernest Worthing who is your guardian. And so, here, and she says quite sure, and then there's a pause. And I think this pause here is a sort of almost a Pinterian moment, that she's certain that this is not who he is, that he is in fact Uncle Jack, and that not Mr. Ernest Worthing. But this uncertainty of identity is both like the destabilizing effects of the naming conventions in a birthday party. The moments where they call each other Simon, Nat, and Dermot. We have this completely sort of alienating, destabilizing effect, and then also this pause here, I think, shows us that her uncertainty, and the irony is that this ends up being a sort of reversed in the outcome of the play, that the uncertainty that we see in this pause ends up becoming true. So she's quite sure that it's Ernest Worthing who's your guardian, and she's obviously not at this point in time, but that outcome that he ends up being called this ends up becoming true. Even at this point in time, it's a lie. Further down, Gwendolen says quite politely, rising, my darling Cecily, I think there must be some slight error. Mr. Ernest Worthing is engaged to me. The announcement will appear in the Morning Post on Saturday at the latest. Cecily very politely rising, I'm afraid you must be under some misconception. I think here, the falsity in social conventions shows us that we've got this kind of, that the stage directions here are masks for jealousy. And I think they invite comparison with the issue of sitting and seating in a birthday party, and the concept of power as it relates to it. Further down, Gwendolen examines diary through her lorgnette carefully. Certainly very curious, for he asked me to be his wife yesterday afternoon at 5:30. If you would care to verify that incident, pray do so, and produces a diary of her own. I never travel without my diary. One should always have something sensational to read in the train. And so it's life itself that is unrealistic, which is an ironic moment here because it's actually affirming the truth. So we're talking about this incident that, they're quibbling over this incident that's recorded in the diary, as if life itself is sensational and is aestheticized. And actually, what's being aestheticized is real. So we come back to that moment of aestheticism where life ends up mirroring art. Gwendolen and Cecily then exchange meditatively. If the poor fellow has been entrapped into any foolish promise, I shall consider it my duty to rescue him at once with a firm hand. And Cecily then thoughtfully and sadly says, whatever unfortunate entanglement my dear boy may have got into, I will never reproach him with it after we are married. Do you allude to me, Miss Cardew, as an entanglement? You are presumptuous. On an occasion of this kind, it becomes more than a moral duty to speak one's mind. It becomes a pleasure. And this exchange here, this feigned politeness, is that language that seems to mark power in so many of these texts, particularly that feigned politeness that Goldberg, particularly, and McCann is also partly expert in using, especially at those moments of social ritual, when you have a salutation or a greeting, someone arrives, someone leaves. This is one of those moments where we see that sense of competition being shrouded by the polite rituals of language. Cecily then says, "Do you suggest, Miss Fairfax, that I entrapped Ernest into an engagement? How dare you? This is no time for wearing the shallow mask of manner. When I see a spade, I call it a spade. I'm glad to say that I have never seen a spade. It is obvious that our social spheres have been widely different." And so we have this really interesting badinage, this sort of witty exchange between the two of them. Both are guilty, and they are both aware of their, I think, sense of class superiority and the hollowness of the social manners that they both invoke here, which I think is obviously comparable to the Mitch-Blanche relationship and the reasons why it goes wrong. But actually here they end up striking up a friendship on the basis of that sense of superiority. But also Gwendolyn's response, "I've never seen a spade." So she thinks, Cecily, through her witticism, that she has been earnest herself and been critical of this hypocrisy. But then Gwendolyn's trump card is basically class superiority. And that's what wins out in the end. Our social spheres have been widely different. Merriman then arrives, followed by the footman. He carries a salver, tablecloth, and a plate stand. Cecily is about to retort. The presence of the servants exercises a restraining influence under which both girls chafe. "Shall I lay tea here as usual, miss?" Sternly, in a calm voice. "Yes, as usual." And so we have this sense here of an ironic entrance, that we have this extended dialogue that makes a mockery of the polite surfaces of the upper classes. And then the servants' arrival, the sort of ironic entrance, becomes a moderating influence. So the lower class is actually, we have that moment of ending where our social spheres have been widely different, and actually it's Merriman that pointedly moderates the hostility between the two of them. So we have this entrance being used extremely ironically by Wilde at this moment in time. They carry on, though. Cecily and Gwendolyn. "5 counties, I don't think I should like that. I hate crowds. I suppose that's why you live in town." Gwendolyn bites her lip and beats her foot nervously with her parasol. So we have, again, this... there's a sort of battle for power here, and the stage directions are actually revealing the truth during this exchange, like in a birthday party. We see this as we look further down. Cecily sweetly says this, and then Gwendolyn is looking round. And then Gwendolyn, further down the page, with elaborate politeness, says, "Thank you. As an aside, detestable girl, but I require tea." And then Cecily sweetly says, "Sugar?" And then she superciliously says, "No, thank you. Sugar is not fashionable anymore." Cecily looks angrily at her and takes up the tongs and puts 4 lumps of sugar into the cup. So again, that stage direction as a revelation of truth over and above language is, again, something that invites comparison to the birthday party most directly, but also Streetcar as well. Cecily then cuts a very large slice of cake and puts it on the tray, says, "Hand that to Miss Fairfax." And so we have this sense of food, again, being used around the sense of sexual vitality that I think is invoked very frequently in Streetcar through those colours, particularly those big, bold colours that Stanley's clothing is constantly being described as containing. Merriman does so and goes out with the footman. Gwendolyn drinks the tea and makes a grimace, puts down a cup at once, reaches out her hand to the bread and butter, looks at it and finds it is cake, rises in indignation. So the actions here are what reveals the sort of duplicity of language here, and that this, I think, is comparable to Goldberg and McCann, that they're talking about, I don't want sugar in my tea and I ask for bread and butter, but what you've actually given me is something fake. And I think this sort of deliberately farcical set piece of physical theatre that Wilde creates is supposed to deliberately expose the hollowness of the manners that they adhere to and the promises that they make each other. And it functions like drink and Streetcar. Gwendolyn then says, "From the moment I saw you, I distrusted you. I felt that you were false and deceitful. I am never deceived in such matters. My first impressions of people are invariably right." And again, this exposes her own short-sightedness, because previously, only a few pages before, she was very ready, within a couple of minutes, to confidently declare that her first impressions are never wrong. And so she deliberately contradicts herself here. And I think this, again, invites comparison to Blanche and Ephraim, because I think that, and Stanley Weather with a lack of glasses, all of those central characters in these plays have this flawed vision that in the end in the other three players costs them something, whereas for Gwendolyn, because she has power on her side, ultimately it costs her nothing. Jack then enters at this vital moment. It seems to me, Miss Fairfax, that I'm trespassing on your valuable time. No doubt you have many other calls of a similar character to make in the neighbourhood. This polite language again that's actually deliberately trying to get her to leave. And then this Jack enters. And so there's a sense here of the comic code saving the social order, which is a contrast with Goldberg and McCann's actual disruption of the social order here through their entrance in the play. Jack's entry here that creates the sort of farcical irony of this scene, where they both think that it's someone different, actually is what in the end preserves power and preserves the social order. So they are both centered here around who this person is, and obviously the resolution of who this person is what in the end gets rid of their rivalry and creates that preserving effect. Cecily very sweetly says, I know there must be some misunderstanding, Miss Fairfax. The gentleman whose arm is at present round your waist is my guardian, Mr. John Worthing. I beg your pardon. And so McCann and Goldberg's naming here of themselves as Dermot and Symee is sort of vengeful. There's something angry and disturbing about this. But the disguise motif and the mistaken identities motif in the play here is a sort of genial unraveling of comic felicity in the social order's re-establishment. And then Cecily says, this is Uncle Jack, and she recedes and says, Jack, oh, there's this sudden shock around the instability of identity that actually produces comic resolution rather than unsettling disturbance. Further down they exchange, yes, to good heavens, Gwendolyn, I mean to Gwendolyn. Of course not, Algernon says. What could have put such an idea into your pretty little head? And they're talking here about who they're actually speaking to. Ernest, may I ask you, are you engaged to be married to this young lady? And Algernon's looking around. To what young lady? Good heavens, Gwendolyn. Yes, to good heavens, Gwendolyn. I mean to Gwendolyn. Of course not. What could have put such an idea in your pretty little head? Thank you. And then we've got this sort of multiple layered confusion because Cecily believes that Algernon is Ernest. And then, of course, Gwendolyn believes that he's entirely someone else. Thank you. Presenting her cheek to be kissed, you may. And then Algernon kisses her. So there's, again, this sort of sense of female dominance here, that physical romance can only be expressed at the behest of the female characters. And then Cecily breaks away from him. After Gwendolyn says, I felt there was some slight error, Miss Cardew. The gentleman who is now embracing you is my cousin, Mr. Algernon Moncrieff. And she breaks away. Algernon Moncrieff. Oh, the two girls move towards each other and put their arms around each other's waists as if for protection. So here they kind of united in hostility to reality. So there is this moment here of reality, I think, disturbing the aesthetic surface that is very much comparable to what happens to Blanche. However, it in the end resolves itself pleasantly and comically, whereas for Blanche, the resolution culminates in the destruction of herself.